Glamrock Freddy is undoubtedly one of FNAF's most iconic characters, becoming a fan favorite following the success of Security Breach. But what does the fandom actually know about him? Despite leading FNAF's newest mainline animatronic band, we still don't know a whole lot about him. From his identity to why he's so different, and even where he ends up after Security Breach, fans are still thinking about what makes him so special. In today's episode, that's exactly what we'll be trying to find out. In Security Breach, we get some insight into not only Glamrock Freddy's, but the origins of every Pt1 star from none other than the Endo Nursery on Sub-Basement Level 2. Most players don't normally stick around this area too long due to it being one of the most painstaking areas in the entire game, but I think fans at least picked up on the fact that this is where the Pt1's many animatronics first started out. This idea actually got its own entire level in Help Wanted 2, where we play as a phas technician tasked with training a blank endoskeleton to interact with guests. Although animatronics appear to develop some of their own personality during this stage, most is defined by which character they're set to become. Glamrock Freddy can actually have an existential crisis about this if you bring him to the Endo Nursery in Security Breach. Besides that, while his raising in the nursery doesn't seem to have gone differently than any other Glamrock, what does actually set him apart is something on his shell. In Ruin, we got a better look at Glamrock Freddy's shell than we do in Security Breach while he's lying down, and what we see is the word prototype written on his foot. While Dread Unit does mention Glamrock Freddy and Chica as some of the earliest animatronics decided for the Pt1, it's certainly interesting that Glamrock Freddy himself would be made as an early prototype. Considering this was likely the very first Pt1 makes it a little less surprising that their main animatronic would have been made early enough to be a prototype, though does that have any actual impact on why Freddy is the way he is? Well, for now no, as the prototype tag appears to either be a simple reference to FNAF World like much of Security Breach has been doing, or something that Stillwell hasn't quite elaborated on yet. While some theorists did debate whether or not this prototype meant Ruin's Glamrock Freddy wasn't the same Glamrock Freddy as in Security Breach, I think we can safely say that this is intended to be a retroactive detail added to the main Glamrock Freddy instead of being a completely different one, as explaining how this other animatronic bearing the same damage as Glamrock Freddy also without its head ended up here in place of the now missing original body wouldn't make much sense now, would it? We can also hear Glamrock Freddy's Security Breach dialogue while in Phazerblast in Ruin, so I think that's a pretty dang clear indicator. Moving past that, there are still a few other events surrounding Glamrock Freddy which we know directly affected what happened to him. Enter the Storyteller tree, an installation in the Pt1's atrium meant to automate and outsource Fazbear's creative team to AI. Unfortunately, that particular AI ended up being the Mimic 1 program, coming from the Mimic's original head. Plugging this head into the Pt1 not only caused glitches in much of its systems, but also ended up changing the Glamrock's personality for the worse. Specifically, Glamrock Freddy went from uplifting and lively to childish and pouty, best shown by him literally having a tug-of-war fight with a little girl over a Freddy plush, which he ends up giving up on and pouting in the corner about. One might even consider Glamrock Freddy's snarky remarks about knowing the difference between Jimmy and Timmy's cakes in Help Wanted 2 to be an example of his negatively affected personality. Needless to say, this contrast between Freddy's behavior before and after the Storyteller tree is dramatic, but it's only a drop in the bucket compared to what happened to Freddy next. Let's cut to a kid named Gregory, who, by whatever means, would become taken over by Glitchtrap like how Vanessa was, with a piece of his soul now sealed away in the Balloon World arcade hidden in the daycare. Similar to Vanny, Gregory's new personality, who we'll dub GGY, would get right to work, which first included hacking into the Glamrocks to alter their code. Later, when a girl with the username of Morgan99, actually named Crystal, would hack into the Glamrocks herself to learn about their behavior, she'd notice additional conversations and behaviors that shouldn't have been there. These additions also included a series of G's and Y's left as a signature by GGY, showing traces of his work. This tampering is first seen when a boy named Tony Becker begins to look into the mystery of GGY at the Pt1, which sets Glamrock Freddy on high alert, causing him to intensely stare together and even subtly follow Tony around the Pizzaplex. Freddy, being GGY's main lackey, might even suggest him being involved in the disappearances of 5 therapist counselors working at his school, who he made go missing after they started digging into his activity at the Mega Pizzaplex. While 2 of the first 3 were currently missing, 1 was found who looked like they were mangled by machinery. With how much GGY uses Glamrock Freddy, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that he could have actually been responsible for the deaths of those 5 therapists, and maybe even Tony himself, meaning Glamrock Freddy might genuinely have blood on his hands. While what GGY does with Glamrock Freddy is certainly a huge shift for his character, one of the most major events for him actually comes following Vanessa's arrival at the Pizzaplex. Vanessa, now Vanny at the Pizzaplex, would have a conversation with Glitchtrap instructing her to select one of the Glamrocks for a specific task. Due to her appearance specifically in the Glamrock Freddy teaser, we know that she selected him for the task we'd come to discover in one of the endings of Security Breach. It appears that Vanessa's main task from Glitchtrap at the Pizzaplex was to unearth the currently ruined Mimic endoskeleton at the pizza place after being springlocked in a jester costume before the Pizzaplex even opened. Unfortunately, at that time, the pizza place was also sealed shut with a load of cement at the front door, meaning someone would need to clear the path in, being none other than Glamrock Freddy. We hear about this on our way to the Burn Trap ending, where Glamrock Freddy recollects clearing the path, as well as something else that was the key moment his character would change completely. Glamrock Freddy mentions finding himself for the first time, and that line has been a huge point of discussion for theorists as to what exactly it meant. While some think it's about him becoming possessed by some remaining spirit in the pizza place, I think using context clues from that same monologue tells us exactly what we need to know about what happened to Freddy. In his speech, he mentions that he had no choice in the matter of what Vanny forced him to do, but now he has a choice and is changed. Then he says his friends are here and they are so angry and confused. Freddy's specifically talking about the Glamrocks here, since they appear during the Burn Trap boss fight and he refers to them as his friends throughout most of the game. What's so interesting here is how the line about Glamrock Freddy's friends being so angry and confused being right next to the line about how he's changed seems to intentionally highlight what's exactly so different about him. In the world of Security Breach, it's clear that the Glamrocks aren't really able to control themselves. We know these animatronics have 2 modes, the safe mode we can see Glamrock Freddy reboot in Security Breach, and the standard mode seen in Help Wanted 2, which most of the Pizzaplex should be operating in. We also know that in some way, all of the Pizzaplex, including the Glamrocks, is actively trapped in this corrupted standard mode. While their infection from the Mimic 1 program did result in some abnormal behaviors, it wouldn't have been able to cause any actual aggression towards Pizzaplex visitors. That, and their corrupted safe mode appears to come later from Glitchtrap corrupting the Pizzaplex from an infected email Vanessa sent to all Fazbear staff, making its way into the Pizzaplex and to the Glamrocks. That's how Vanessa initially forced Freddy to go down to the pizza place and clear the path blocking her entrance. However, something happened down there that changed Freddy. For whatever reason following this incident, he developed a sort of free will that we haven't seen anywhere else in the Pizzaplex that seems to kick in whenever his directive from Glitchtrap tries to take over. Case in point, when Glamrock Freddy spots who is almost certainly Gregory in the crowd just before Security Breach, his programming notes Gregory as a threat, but his newly competing free will results in him crashing completely and rebooting in safe mode. This has also likely happened many times, as the one we see at the beginning of Security Breach definitely isn't the first. We see examples of this in Security Breach's early trailers, with Freddy traveling with Gregory, though in that case getting caught by Vanny in the end. Ultimately, while it's not exactly clear what happened to Glamrock Freddy at the pizza place, I think we can safely say it does not involve any possession like Mike Lafton, Charlotte Emily, or any other prior spirit. Judging from emphasis on the Mimic 1 program and Mimic itself, this new era of FNAF is diving headfirst into an AI emphasis. And odds are, that means the narrative of Glamrock Freddy would way more likely be an AI gaining sentience or free will than dredging up an old spirit. I'd sooner imagine that the reason we don't know exactly what happened to Freddy at the pizza place is due to the core of Security Breach's story being lost in translation by Steelwool. Though while we might still not exactly have that detail, I think it still remains pretty clear what the results of this event are. Unlike his friends who are still left angry and confused, sometimes even crying out like we hear Glamrock Chica do sometimes in Security Breach, Glamrock Freddy has at least enough free will to defy orders given to him by Glitchtrap and Vanny, though just barely. Certain conditions, such as rapid fluctuations in temperature, power level, or even misinputs in maintenance can set him off into his standard mode, allowing for Glitchtrap to take right back over again. Thankfully, none of this actually happens during the events of Security Breach, leaving Glamrock Freddy as Gregory's go-to helper when he too periodically escapes Glitchtrap's control, with the two perhaps even having a subconscious connection from when Gregory controlled Freddy while still under the control of Glitchtrap. Due to Vanny catching Freddy helping Gregory a few times before Security Breach, she begins cutting Freddy off from the main Petesplex network so he won't be able to help out as easily. Fortunately, that still doesn't really change much, as the events of Security Breach still play out as normal, where Gregory and Freddy with his new upgrades go to face Vanny. While Vanny is able to disable Freddy by having a swarm of nightmare staff bots rip him apart, Gregory's still able to make it all the way up to her room where he beats Princess Quest 3, wounding Glitchtrap and releasing the part of Vanessa that was trapped in that game. After the corrupted staff bots deactivate, Gregory recovers Freddy's head since his body's basically destroyed, and makes his way out of the Petesplex to meet Vanessa. That at least is where the story of Glamrock Freddy sat until we got Security Breach's Ruin DLC, where we got to see Cassie take a trip back into Fazerblast. In Ruin, we see the entrance vent to Fazerblast absolutely covered in graffiti talking about a bad bear and Fazfiend, which once Cassie finds it, appears to be referencing the left-behind corpse of Glamrock Freddy. We see that on top of having the aforementioned prototype tag on his foot, he now has a withered gift box in what now looks more like a sharp-toothed stomach mouth. Without the head Gregory took at the end of Security Breach, Freddy's malfunctioning body now appears to be drawn to sound when it chases Cassie, who's only able to escape it by actually entering the Vanny network, since the body itself is no longer connected to any networks due to its missing head. While this does technically mark the end of Glamrock Freddy's story, and we have already dissected what made Freddy so special in the first place, I believe one loose end from Security Breach and Ruin could not only open up a much bigger debate about Freddy's oddities, but also help us predict even more of Glamrock Freddy's origins. Think about the fact that Glamrock Freddy actually has a lot more in common with Fredbear than he does with Freddy Fazbear. This can first be seen in the maintenance sections of Security Breach, where after fixing up Freddy with some of the Glamrock parts, his bow tie turns purple. And not just slightly purple, but quite purple actually. It's clear from interviews with Steelbowl that they're aware of being careful about color theory in FNAF, so you'd think this design choice would be intentional, especially because this isn't the only time they did this. All the way back at Glamrock Freddy's green room, we can see a neon light featuring him with a yellow base and purple details. This connection to Fredbear was built on even more when we had Freddy become just a head at the end of Security Breach, as another clear parallel to Golden Freddy and Fredbear. That is on top of being the companion to a character with some obvious narrative symbolism to the Crying Child, like with the Fredbear plush in FNAF 4. Heck, even Cassie says that the Golden Glamrock Freddy plush, simply titled AR Golden Freddy, looks just like the one in the lobby, which in itself is another clear connection to Golden Freddy. Most players either didn't notice these connections, or at least didn't focus on them until it became much more apparent with how we see Glamrock Freddy in Ruin. Specifically, Ruined Freddy's stomach mouth being a direct callback to Fredbear's stomach mouth in FNAF 4. In essence, Glamrock Freddy is honestly more of a Fredbear than an actual Freddy Fazbear, obviously not by namesake, but with how he's been depicted so far, and that is particularly interesting. We pretty much already know what's up with his AI Sentience, but his connections to Fredbear not so much. So far, I think I've got two ideas as to what could be going on here. The first idea, working to fill in the gap of what could have actually happened at FFPS, would be if Glamrock Freddy isn't possessed by some spirit, but the actual Fredbear himself. Specifically, this Fredbear from Ultimate Custom Night, who despite not being any sort of spirit, appears to be his own entity. He thinks there was more fantasy and fun where he came from, so he appears to be somehow the actual character of Fredbear himself. While how he manifested isn't exactly clear, one answer could be that he's the imaginary friend of FNAF 4 that the Crying Child created in the face of his trauma that potentially became Shadow Freddy after the bite. Now think about how everyone seeing the FFPS location in Security Breach thought Glamrock Freddy could have been possessed by some spirit from that game, either Michael Afton, Henry Emily, or maybe even Charlotte Emily. Those were all decent guesses, but think about what the place really is. This FFPS location is likely just a repurposed Fredbear's Family Diner, and if there was actually one spirit dominating the whole building, that could make its way into Glamrock Freddy, I'd imagine it would be Fredbear himself. Does that mean Glamrock Freddy would also secretly be Shadow Freddy? That I'm not quite sure of, though it would certainly tie into his connection to Nightmare Fredbear, with Nightmare himself as his mirror counterpart. Ultimately, this idea is just me throwing my hat in the ring on who would be possessing Glamrock Freddy if he were possessed, which funny enough would not be by an actual spirit. Though beyond that, as a way more grounded theory, we have idea 2, which actually comes from Corey of Dual Process Theory, who hadn't quite found the means of turning this into any content. So I'm free to share it here. Instead of focusing on FFPS and Freddy's potential possession, let's go all the way back to his upbringing as a Glamrock endoskeleton, being trained in the nursery. Specifically focus on that element of learned training, as well as another ability these endos have that most might forget about, which is technically shapeshifting. While Glamrock endos do normally look like they'd fit into Glamrock Freddy, Bonnie, or Monty, they'd have to compress their body down to fit into the shells of Roxy and Chica, which is exactly what I think they do. Observatory training plus shapeshifting like this are both key features of the Mimic and its Mimic 2 series from the 80s, which is why for the last while now, I've pointedly nicknamed these Glamrock endos the Mimic 3 series. They're obviously not mimics themselves, but a majority of their technology appears to be directly based on the Mimic, and this appears to be a common theme in the current era of FNAF. Whether you realize it by now or not, most of the new elements of Steelwool's FNAF are actually subtle foreshadowing to things that they've been prepping to show off in FNAF's origins all the way back in the late 70s with Secret of the Mimic. So far, we've seen vintage Freddy and Friends cartoons, the Nightmarian plushies, and the Mimic being a key part of all of FNAF's modern technology, but I don't think it stops there. Think about how in Help Wanted 2, we train a Glamrock endo to interact with guests just fine, but we don't train it to be the actual character. If we can assume that Glamrock endos do receive training specific to their character, then what are they trained on? Corey's idea was that for whatever reason, Glamrock Freddy was trained on Fredbear's source material rather than that of Freddy Fazbear, and that explanation could go to explain a few curiosities of Glamrock Freddy in Security Breach. Not only would it tie into some of the symbolic oddities of Freddy, such as his purple bow tie, severed head like Golden Freddy, and stomach mouth like Nightmare Fredbear, it might finally explain why Glamrock Freddy's so close to Glamrock Bonnie. Remember that the days of Fredbear's Family Diner didn't have Foxy or Chica, just Fredbear and Spring Bonnie up on stage, whose characters presumably would have been pretty close. This itself would be its own parallel to the closeness between William Afton and Henry Emily, which bordered on crazed obsession in William's case. Training Glamrock Freddy and maybe even Glamrock Bonnie off of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie would explain their closeness, which you have to admit is the best gay representation in FNAF so far. I would know, cause I was the one who got to take home the Glamrock Freddy love poster from PAX, and can confirm it is just as glorious in person as it is in the actual game. But anyways, regardless of which of these theories is more likely, I still think we'll ultimately see something like this in Secret of the Mimic, where from playing the demo, we've already seen not only the vintage Fredbear's Family Diner posters, but also pizza boxes from Fredbear's itself. If we happen to run into the Fredbear animatronic in Secret of the Mimic, or more specifically recordings of him performing, then now you might have a better idea of why that cameo was so important in the first place. Though until that game comes out, this was what makes Glamrock Freddy so special. With this video, I was looking forward to outlining some of the parts of Glamrock Freddy's story some fans often forget, as well as putting a few ideas out there that you can all look forward to in Secret of the Mimic. But until then, thank you for watching.